Next on American History TV, author Fariborz Mokhtari talks about his book In the Lion's Shadow, the Iranian Schindler and his homeland in the Second World War. He explains how Muslim Iranian diplomat Abdol Hossein Sardari rescued 2,000 Iranian Jews in occupied France from the Nazis. The University of South Florida hosted this event. It's just over an hour.
Tonight, we're honored to have Dr. Fariborz Mokhtari as our book talk guest. Born in Isfahan, Iran, Dr. Mokhtari attended undergraduate and graduate school in the United States at the College of Worcester in Ohio, and then at the University of Delaware. He returned to Iran in 1973, and when I got the bio, I had to think about these 6 years. And in 6 years, worked as a journalist for the Kehan group of newspapers. He fulfilled military service. He created an agribusiness enterprise and served as the deputy executive director of the Iran British Chamber of Commerce, all from 1973 to 1979, when he returned to the United States and was appointed assistant professor at Norwich University. 1983, promoted, became a department chair, and then went on to be the director of military graduate program and then a special assistant to the university president at Norwich. He joined the faculty at the Near East South Asia Center of Strategic Studies at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. in 2002, where he remained until his retirement in late 2011. He's taught at the University of Vermont as an adjunct and at St. Michael's College as a scholar in residence. In USF World, we seek to understand, tolerate, and respect others. We seek to challenge surface-level narrative and to bring those from different worlds together with a view to celebrating as much what we have in common as what divides us. In this regard, I'm absolutely delighted to focus tonight's book talk on Dr. Fariborz Mokhtari. Please welcome Dr. Mokhtari.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening again. You're stuck with me for another hour and 10 minutes. The first 40 minutes, I am going to ask some questions about the book, and you have the book here, and I think we have a few copies outside. After the end, it's called In the Lion's Shadow. Right after the end of the program, you can buy the book. In fact, it's mandatory that you buy the book, and he will sign it. So for the first 40 minutes, I'm going to ask him to discuss his book. I'm going to ask him some tough questions about his book. And then after 40 minutes, you'll ask some questions, or you share your observation about his book. Dr. Mokhtari, thank you very much for accepting my invitation. I know you have a busy schedule, so I'm grateful to you for accepting the invitation. You cannot hear me? No. Can you hear me now? Okay.
It's the house PA just isn't up that loud.
Okay. I am going to speak as loud as I can. Is that okay now? Can you hear me?
The mic is not picking up. Can you adjust it? Is it on?
It is on.
Let's turn that one off.
It's all C-SPAN fault. Can you hear me now? All right. What did I tell you? So I'm going to start by asking you some... and mine is on. Okay. All right. So everything I said, please ignore it and let's start fresh. The first question I have is about the central character of your book, a guy by the name of Sardari. Please tell us a little bit about his background, who he was, and also tell us how you ended up looking into his case, because frankly, a lot of people, including, not a lot, the overwhelming majority of Iranians, as well as Americans, didn't know about this important historical episode. So please tell us about Mr. Sardari, the central character of the book, and how you ended up spending 7 years of your life researching about him.
Well, thank you. First of all, I thank you for the reception, very generous introduction, and all of you for being here. Sardari was the central character of the book.
Is the other one on?
How do you know whether it's on or not?
No, it's on.
The central character.
Is that okay now? All right.
The central character of the book, Abdol Hossein Sardari, who was a junior diplomat in Paris during the occupation of France, came from a prominent family. His grandmother was a princess, and therefore he came from a family that was well-positioned, well-educated, and wealthy. He was sent to Europe at the age of 8, in fact, in England, to a boarding school. So he studied in England. And then after he finished high school, he went to Switzerland, University of Geneva, and he studied there. And after he graduated, he completed his doctoral degree in law. So that's, his background. When he was in Switzerland, his younger sisters, her younger sister was married to the gentleman who was Iran's envoy. He didn't have the title of ambassador to Bern, Switzerland, and he gave him a position at the Iranian legation in Bern, and then later on he liked his work so much that he invited him to join the foreign ministry, Iranian foreign ministry, as a regular diplomat, and he did, and he was accepted. A couple of years, this happened in 1938 or so. A year later, the Iranian foreign minister decided that this guy in Bern should become Iranian envoy in Paris, France, and he moved there and took this young man with him, because he was the kind of person who would get things done, and of course he was well educated, and he spoke several languages. He spoke German, he spoke French, and he spoke English, and he really was very good. Although he'd left Iran at the age of 8, his Persian was excellent. His handwriting is really remarkable. And the reason for that is that when he was sent to England, a chaperone was sent with him who actually was his educator. So anyway, this is the background. Now, let me give you a footnote, because this relates to Dr. Milani here. How did I get interested in this? I was reading his brother's book, and there is a footnote in his brother's books. And the footnote is something, if I recall correctly, there is a rumor that there was an Iranian diplomat in France during the war that helped Jews. Well, being an Iranian, I thought, this is a wonderful thing to know. There's a sense of pride in this. So I called him up. It took about 6 months before he answered my call, by the way. But when he did, he said, I heard this from 3 people, and he gave me the names. He didn't have the telephone numbers, but gave me the names. I found those 3 people. One of them actually was residing in Florida, that Mr. Tawakkoli, who had been Consul General of Iran in Milan, Italy. I got the information from them. Then I found some of the survivors in Los Angeles. I talked to them, and then went to the National Archives, and that is where the real work began. So that is the background.
So the event took place, if I'm not mistaken, from 1940 to 1942-43. Am I correct?
No, it continued until 1946-47.
47.
Yep.
So before we get into what Sardari did, I want to take you back to Iran so that the audience has a better understanding of what was taking place in Iran during World War II. Please tell us about who was in power and what was the status of Iran at that time during World War II. And then we get back to the story.
Okay. Well, in order to really understand what was going on in Iran during the Second World War, you have to go back to the First World War. Iran had declared its neutrality before the First World War began, but Russia, Turkey, Ottoman Empire at the time, and the British, of course, they invaded the country, and they fought their wars inside Iran, as a result of which there was tremendous devastation, hunger, famine, and stories are that 1/3 of the population of the country lost its life due to starvation. Now, with that background, the moment that the situation in Europe started getting sort of threatening, Iran declared its neutrality again. Now, Iran, from 1925, Iran had started a rapid development program, politically, militarily, socially, etc., etc. Rapid development. And therefore, the central power was in the hands of a new king, Reza Shah, who had been a military officer, staged a coup, and so on. He was, by the way, invited to become king by the parliament. So he staged a coup, but not for himself at that point. This happened a couple of years later. With that background, they didn't want Iran to be invaded. They didn't want the pace of development to stop, etc. And of course, Iranians and the government, of course, did not trust the British. They did not trust the Russians. And they were disappointed with the United States. Why? Because Iran wanted a different power to help it, because the British had exploited the country, the Russians had been absolutely nasty, and therefore they wanted another power. They went to the United States, they asked the United States for assistance, the United States made promises, they sent a number of delegates, the Russians objected to that, and they basically talked the State Department into withdrawing the delegation they had sent. The promises of investment in Iran never materialized. In search of finding somebody else, they found Germany as a source that they could approach to counterbalance the Russian influence and the British. And they also approached Sweden, although Sweden really wasn't a military power, but it provided technical assistance and so on. And the railroad in Iran, a magnificent railroad was constructed without a cent of borrowing. They didn't borrow a cent from outside. First it was the Americans, then the Swedes helped construct that railroad. Anyway, getting back to the main theme, Iran declared neutrality. The day that Germany attacked Russia, it declared its neutrality for a second time. Yet Iran was invaded at the end of August 25th, I think it was, 1941, the Allied forces. The reason they gave was that there are a lot of Germans in Iran, and therefore, this is not a good thing. Well, the fact of the matter is that there were 600 Germans in Iran working mostly for technical issues, construction of things, radio transmitters, and so on. And many of them, by the way, were Jews, because Jews with education in Germany were trying to get out. From the time the Nazis came to power, they were trying to get out. And quite a few of them ended up in Iran, some of them in Turkey, anywhere they could go. So there were 600 Germans working in Iran, some of them with their families. At the very same time, there were 2,500 British working in Iran in the oil fields and so on, and 300 Russians, and 150 Czechoslovaks, and about 110 Italians. So the idea that 600 Germans were posing a threat to the Allies is really nonsense. And the basic reason for doing it, for invading the country, was they wanted to use the railroad system and the roads that had been constructed with so much sacrifice in the country. They raised the money by putting a tax on sugar and tea, and they built those. Well, the Allies wanted to use Iranian ports, Iranian highways, and Iranian railroads to send supplies to Russia. Now, Iran actually was willing to allow them to do that, provided they would pay for the use of these. But of course, the British and the Russians did not want to do that, so they found it cheaper, as some governments usually do, to invade. Military action seems to be more pleasing to them than other means. So they invaded the country, and when they invaded, a number of things happened. One of them was deposing the king and sending him into exile.
So if I have to sort of summarize what you're saying, is that Iran declared its neutrality, and at the same time, the Allied forces paid no attention to that declaration. They occupied the country, and the purpose of the occupation was to have material from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Soviet Union in order to defeat the Germans. But it is also important to remind the people here that it was around the same time a movement in Iran, or perhaps there was a tendency in Iran, to support the Germans, not only because they wanted to get the support of Germany against the British and the Russians, but also because some people really bought the nonsense about the Aryan race. And the Iranians, some Iranians, bought into this argument. This is why the name of Persia, which was the official name of the Persian Empire at that time, was changed to Iran, because that is supposed to be the land of the Aryans. So I agree with you that there were only 600 Germans, but the British and the Americans also saw some tendencies in Iran that worried them in terms of providing intelligence to the British and the Americans. But that is for next event that I'm going to invite you to. So let's go back to Mr. Sardari now. This is time of the World War II, and he is in the Iranian embassy in Paris. Why did he decide to help the Jews, and who were those Jews that he tried to help?
Well, not to answer your first, things is a lump in my throat now, but
I know
but
this.
I live with it. Sardari, again, please remember that this guy was an educated guy. He had a legal education, and he spoke several languages. And he was a very sociable guy. So he had many friends. So he knew what the Nazis were capable of doing. He knew what they were planning to do, even if they hadn't really started doing things. And because of that, from the early days of the war, he actually started planning things, how to counter some of these racial policies, which apparently was extremely appalling to him. Now, why is that? Well, again, you find some of the things in his personal life that could tell you something about this. Remember, he was sent to Europe at the age of 8. So as a child, he was deprived of his family and the love of his parents and so on. So this is a guy who was basically left alone from childhood. He was treated not very nicely with his mother, especially. because she favored the eldest son and the youngest daughter. And there were 7 children, and he was the middle one. So he was neglected from that point of view too. With that background, he couldn't understand, and he couldn't find the reasoning, the humanitarian impulse that makes people being nasty to other human beings. So that is on a personal level. The war started, and the Germans came to France, and because the Iranian legation in Paris was accredited to the French government, when the French government moved to Vichy, the ambassador and the embassy went to Vichy, and they put this guy, the young diplomat who was a consular, in charge of the embassy. From that point on, he uses his position, and of course the key to the safe and so on, to do the things that he had actually anticipated that had to be done. Now, again, it sounds simple, but he had to have a network. The first thing he did was to call in the Iranian Jewish community, most of whom were businessmen and involved in export, import, usually textiles, antiques, and so on. He got them together and asked them to form a group of leaders who could communicate with him on a regular basis. They did. They actually elected 5 people amongst themselves, wealthy businessmen. One of them, whom I had the pleasure of talking to extensively at the age of 92, was a gentleman called Moradi, Ibrahim Moradi. They called him Ibi Moradi. He said the 5 of us got together, and then we decided we have to raise some money to help. I'll explain to you why they needed money, to help establish a network that would help Sardari, in fact, come up with papers and so on for the community. He said we got together, and then one of them said, well, we have to go and collect money from the members of the community. And then he said, one of the 5 said, why are we doing this? All 5 of us are wealthy enough. We can do that. We don't have to go and ask people for money. And these 5 actually undertook the responsibility of spending the money that was needed to create the background for the documentation. Now, why was money needed? It wasn't enough for Sardari to issue a passport. The Germans wanted other documents to support this. Therefore, you had to have a supporting document at the local police station. You had to have a supporting document at the local registration office, at the Ministry of Interior, and so on. And in order to do that, you had to have actually agents working there. Now, Sardari himself was extremely effective at cultivating relations with the Germans. Please remember that not all Germans were Nazis. There were many Germans who actually disliked the Nazis with great intensity. They thought of them as riffraff, as good for nothing. One of them was the secretary to the German embassy in Paris, whose name was Graf von Dellmannsingen. Dellmannsingen, by the way, after the war, returned to France and lived in France until the day he died. Dellmannsingen was from an old Bavarian family. In fact, a few years ago, I was in Bavaria. I went to George C. What's this George C. Center? There's a center in. I was on the campus, and I saw a huge building, and on top of it was carved Dellmannsingen. I said, well, what is this? So this is in memory of the General Dellmannsingen, before the war. So to make the long story short, prominent families, prominent German families, didn't like the Nazis. And of course, Sardari knew this. So he cultivated relations with many of these, and they became his secret supporters. If you follow the documents that he exchanged with the Nazis, you see that you get a feeling that he anticipated decisions being made. And he came up with things about weeks before the decision had been officially announced. And I have a gut feeling that it was Denman Singh and people like Denman Singh who actually told him, hey, be careful. This is going to happen. So he tried to preempt those things by the actions he took.
Let me interrupt you. I don't want you to get into details because if you do, nobody's going to buy the book. So, but tell me, where did you get most of your documentations? Because it was rumored that somebody has helped some Jews, and you had to look for actual documentations in order to write the book. Where did you get those?
National Archives. God bless National Archives. National Archives in Washington has a document for anything you can imagine. Now, it's all there. The question is finding it. Because the archives, do you remember, nobody started a list of plan to collect things. They just collected and collected and collected, and year after year they came up with ways of finding things. So finding a document in the National Archives, it is painful. But when you do find it, you have trays of microfiche and microfilm about anything. During the war, when the Germans, by the way, as you know, they documented everything. They are extremely good at that to this day. Anything is well documented, dated, and stamped, and so on. When the Americans reached France and later on Germany, the GIs took every document in every file cabinet and shipped it to the United States. They didn't care whether it was important or not, anything. National Archives, it took 40 years or so.
Including the documents in the Iranian embassy? Or these were from the German embassy?
For German embassy.
Okay.
The actual documents, after they had been copied and microfilmed and so on, were sent to Germany just about 4 years ago. Mm-hmm. So they had kept them all this time. But every document has a copy, microfilm or microfiche, in the National Archives. It took me weeks and weeks until I found the location of the documents I was looking for. They were on the 4th floor on the University of Maryland campus, and there are, of course, cabinets with trays, and each tray is about the size of, 2 or 3 of these chairs put together. And when you pull the tray out, there are hundreds of rolls of microfilm. And each one of those, of course, has thousands of documents on it. So you have to take those out and sit behind those machines and read them until your eyes, fall out. But that's how you find it. That's where they came from.
One reason why you should not pursue an academic job. That's the kind of life we have. Now, this is the German and English version. Did you find any Iranian documents for this book?
Yes. There are Iranian documents. I honestly can't tell you how I got the documents from the Iranian Foreign Ministry archives, because this becomes a question of life and death for the sources.
So maybe you should not even discuss it then. Let's go to the next issue. Now, tell us, who were those Jews that he helped? Tell us about the background of those 2,000.
It started with the Iranian Jews. As I mentioned, there were four guys. I have mentioned their names in the book. They helped him, and he issued papers for them and renewed passports. The beauty of this is that in 1925, Iran changed its passports. New passports were issued. And this actually became an excellent excuse for issuing new passports for people, because the old passports, were no longer valid. So, supposedly. Now, in the old passports, because in 1925, a law was passed that each person had to have a first name, a last name, and a birth certificate with a number. It's in Persian, شماره شناسنامه, the identity number. Before that, people were identified by the name of their fathers, by the profession of themselves and profession of their fathers, and their religion. And that, of course, was a problem. With the new passport, you didn't have any of those things with the exception of your first name, your last name, and your identity number. And therefore, by doing that, he actually removed the possibility of Nazis finding out who was Jewish, who was not. So this is how it started. But then the Iranian Jewish community, the members of that community, came to him and said, well, some of us are married to French women or men, or some of us have French partners. They are really nice people. We don't want them to get into trouble. So he started issuing passports for non-Iranians. And some of the people who have told me that, oh, that doesn't sound right. Well, I ask you, does a name such as Herman Lyobovice, does that sound Persian to you?
They wouldn't know.
This is a very common name in Eastern Europe. An Iranian called Lyobovice, it's just, or there's Alfandari. In Arabic, proper names start with an al, al. In Persian, you don't do that. If I was in an Arab country, they would call me al-Mokhtari, al-Milani. In Iran, we don't do that. So if there is somebody whose name is Alfandari, and on top of that, he was born in Damascus, Syria, that should tell you something. And in his list, there are quite a number of these. Even there was one in Saloniki, Greece, Ilya Goral. That is not a Persian name. Saloniki, So there were quite a number of others who were not Iranian, had no link to Iran, but they were associated with Iranians. So they were also included in this.
So of those 2,000, how many of them have you actually interviewed? Those who were still alive when you were doing the research?
I would say conservatively 5 or 6 of them in Los Angeles, one in Tel Aviv, one in Paris, France. And photographs of them, by the way, are in the book. And there are about 50 photographs in the book. I have about 200 photographs. So I met them, I talked to them, and they were very gracious to me. As I mentioned, Mr. Ibi Moradi was 92 when I met him, and he treated me like his son. I would go to his house, and I would say, Mr. Moradi, I'm so glad to see you. And he would say, what about me? What about me? And he would order food, and he would sit next to me and say, you eat. I said, Mr. Moradi, I'm not hungry. Said, no, you eat. Wonderful man. His son didn't know. By the way, when I met him, I asked him, he said, you sit here. And he had a walker. He walked to his bedroom and then came back with a folder. I have a picture of him with the folder in the book. He opened the folder. He said, yes, this was the fellow. This was his telephone number. This was his address. He was on the list. This was another fellow. He had the names and addresses of all the people who had been involved in this whole episode.
Dr. Mokhtari, Mr. Sardari, whatever decision he made, did the Shah of Iran, either Reza Shah, and then after he was forced to abdicate, his son, Mohammad Reza, do we know, based on documentation, that they knew what Sardari was doing? Not a speculation, documentation.
Reza Shah did not know specifically what Sardari was doing.
Okay.
But Sardari was confident that Reza Shah would not oppose it. Why? Because one time, one of his cabinet ministers had invited the head of the German Nazi youth organization to have an audience with the king. The guy goes in to the royal palace, goes into Reza Shah's office. he was supposed to have an audience for 40 minutes. After 10 minutes, Reza Shah walks out and gives that minister a dressing down. By the way, he had a foul language. When he would get angry, he would really, he gave him a tongue lashing that the guy had to go home and stay out of sight for weeks. And he was a cabinet minister. And he was angry because you bring this riffraff, the Persian version of it, to talk to me. Why? What is his importance? So he actually did not like this sort of thing. His personal physician, by the way, was a German Jew. And there is a document that I have cited. He wanted to go to Germany, and Reza Shah, the minister of Imperial Court, contacts the ambassador of Germany in Tehran. And he says, this guy is going to Germany. He's going there for 11 days and comes back. We want him to be respected and so on. And they did. And in fact, there's a German response to this, that according to our police reports in Berlin, there is nothing against Dr. So-and-so in our files. So he went there and come back. So Reza Shah may not have been aware of what Sardari was doing specifically, but he certainly did not oppose it. There is another document that I have cited. Somebody reports that there are some Jews in Khorramshahr, which is a southern port, that may have been involved in overcharging services that they provide and not paying enough taxes. This was presented at a cabinet meeting at which the king was present. Sometimes he would go to cabinet meetings. And he turns around and tells the national police at the time, you investigate, but make sure that these allegations are true before you inconvenience, the word inconvenience, our citizens who happen to be Jewish. This is a quotation, and it is present. Now, this is for Reza Shah, the last Shah, his son. After the war, Sardari was prosecuted for having done things without proper authorization, issuing passports for non-citizens, for instance, or using the funds that were at the disposal of the U.S. legation, Iranian legation in Paris. This dossier went to the foreign minister. Foreign minister looked at it.
You sure you want to use that word nowadays in this country?
Well, the file.
Yes,
the file
That's
was
much better.
The file was taken to the foreign minister. Foreign minister took it to the prime minister. The prime minister at the time was Ahmad Qavam. Qavam took that file to the Shah, to the king, and told the king, this is the story. Should we prosecute, according to the letter of the law, or what? The Shah issued a royal pardon to the guy.
But with all due respect to you, I still haven't seen any documentation presented by you that Reza Shah, by the way, Reza Shah was the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty that was established in 1926. His son ascended to power in 1941 and ruled Iran until 1979, when he was overthrown by Ayatollah Khomeini in a popular revolution. Based on everything I've heard, we don't know if Reza Shah actually knew what Sardari was doing. You're saying that because he had some sympathy, therefore he would have known. Did he really know what Sardari was?
I was very clear. I said, I don't know whether he knew or not. Okay. I don't think
but he would have been supportive of it.
But he would have been supportive. In fact, there are documents by a Jewish Iranian whose name is Levy. He has written a book. And in that book, here's a quotation, for instance. He said he was representing the Jewish community. He was at an audience one time. And he told Reza Shah that those young Jewish men who are conscripted, are in military service, there are a number of days for religious reasons that they want to go home and get involved in the services and Jewish services and so on. And according to the laws, they cannot go. I mean, they cannot just take those days off. Reza Shah asked him, what are those days? And he takes out a pen out of his pocket. This is Levy's, I have cited that too. On a piece of paper, he writes with his own pen on a piece of paper that Jewish conscripts must be allowed to have these days off. And he directs it to the Minister of War and gives it to this guy to go and deliver it to him and signs it. You know, there are examples of this sort, and I have cited several of them in the book.
So the 2000 somehow escaped persecution or prosecution in France. What happened to Sardari himself?
Well,
how did he die?
After the war, he was assigned to the Iranian embassy in Belgium, and he was there for about 8-9 months, almost a year. And then after that, he was called back to Iran. When he was called back, he was detained for 10 days, and until the royal pardon, let him out. And then a treaty had been signed between Iran, Turkey, Iraq, and Pakistan, and Afghanistan, Central Treaty Organization. Yeah. At that time, they wanted to establish good relations in the neighboring countries. The ambassador to Iraq was a former retired Iranian general, General Batmanghelidj. General Batmanghelidj was a good man and a good general, but not a diplomat. He needed a diplomat. Now, his son had gone to school and had gotten a degree in political science. And he had started working at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but he was a protege of Sardari. So the connection was made, and General Batmanghelidj asked for Sardari to go to Iraq with him. So Sardari goes to Iraq with Batmanghelidj and works at the embassy, and does a wonderful job establishing a relationship because of his personality. In fact, I had a quotation from an ambassador, and he said, being invited to Sardari's home for his version of, there's a Persian dish, fisenjun. It's chicken cooked in pomegranate juice and crushed walnuts. Oh, yeah. So one would kill to be invited to his house for that concoction. So this is how he cultivated relationships, in Iraq. But then there was a coup in Iraq, and as you know, of course, they killed the king in Iraq and so on. So all the embassies left. In fact, the British embassy.
And a lot of Iraqi Jews came to Iraq.
Iraqi Jews. Yeah. Twist of the fate, the British asked Sardari and Batmanghelidj to help them take their documents out of the country. In fact, they put some of the documents in the clothing of their children. Now, the British had been very nasty to Iraq, and here they came and asked the Iranians to help them out. And this is how they brought things out. Now, after that, then Sardari decided that his career in the foreign ministry was really damaged. So he changed his career. He joined the Iranian oil company. And from then on, he was working for the oil company. They sent him to London, and he stayed there.
And where did he die?
He died, some say he died in Croydon, but Nottingham is the place that he actually died.
And how old was he when he died?
I can't tell you right now, but if you find it in the book, the date, I think he died in 1981, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
I have two more questions, and then I'm going to open it to the audience. The first question is personal. When you wrote that book, you spent 7 years, if I'm not mistaken. You spent 7 years of your life researching about this. What impact did it have on you in terms of your approach to the Jewish question, the approach to the relationship between Iranians and the Jews? What exact impact did it have on you personally?
Well, first of all, it was, I gained faith and I gained optimism about humanity. that despite all the nasty things that goes on, good things happen too. And there is hope. There is hope. Our generation, previous generations, quite frankly, excuse the expression, screwed up. Maybe the future generations will not. And I think if we inspire them by letting them know that there is a choice between doing right and doing wrong, maybe they will be persuaded to do what is right just because it's the right thing to do. So that is one part. The second part of it is it gave me a sense of pride in my nationality. The Iranians, for centuries, it really makes you feel good. I remember when I was a toddler, my mother would take me to her parents' home, grandfather, and I remember on occasion, and I quite didn't understand this, but I remember on occasion, he would call he wasn't a servant. There was a guy in Iran, we call him pishkar, a fellow who took care of all his affairs, like a secretary sort. His name was Nazar Khan. He would call Nazar Khan, I've heard this on at least 3-4 occasions. On Saturdays, Nazar Khan, make sure you go to so-and-so's house and turn on the lights and turn on the cooking things and so on. And I never figured out what this was. Later on, I found out Saturday, Orthodox Jews don't turn lights on or don't cook things or don't eat cooked food. And the neighbors, it was on his mind that we got to take care of our neighbors. And the point of all of this, which was confirmed to me, was that to us, it didn't matter what religion you had, as far as you were an Iranian, as far as you were a neighbor, as far as you were one of the community. That is what it mattered. In fact, during the time in Paris, we had Petrosian family. Petrosian, they are famous for caviar. The Petrosian family was the family that catered to the parties that Sardari organized to invite the Germans to basically butter them up. There were Zoroastrian families who came up with documentation from their temples to say, for instance, a gentleman called Sasson. They said, Sasson, actually, this is not a Jewish name. This comes from the Sasanian dynasty. He's a prince, and therefore we certify it. This is from Zoroastrian temple in Yazd. It didn't matter what religion they had. They were Iranian, and therefore that is what counted. I have a quotation that might actually answer a lot of questions. And the quotation is by the Russian ambassador talking to an American reporter. Again, that is quoted in the book. And the Russians, who had tried so hard from 1917 until 1947 to indoctrinate Iranians, to create a communist party, and so on and so forth. He tells the American journalist, I am convinced that Persia is fundamentally sound. He says, what are you talking about? He says, well, you see, they might take money from you today, from us tomorrow, from the Germans the day after, or from the British. They might sell their country 6 times over, but they never deliver. And therefore, I think Persia is fundamentally sound.
Like you, Fariborz, I was born in Iran. And unlike you, I came to this country in my early teens. And I have to tell you, my experience, that's decades before the Islamic Revolution. My experience is identical to yours. In my generation, I looked at people as either Iranians or non-Iranians, whether you were Jews or you were Zoroastrian or you were Christians or you were Baha'is. They were all the same. And the lesson that I learned from the Islamic Revolution is that when you polarize the society, you bring out the worst in people.
Yes.
And when you try to see the commonalities of people, what they have in common, this is what makes a country great. And that, frankly, is one of the reasons why I wanted you to come, because there is a message. My last question is that, what do you want the audience, if they decide to buy your book and read your book, what do you want them to get out of this book? Which is very different than the impact it had on you. What do you want them to get out of this book or pay attention to as they read your book?
Well, two things. Number one, please make a distinction between what the government of any country says and the real sentiments of the population of that country. Number one, just because Mr. So-and-so or Ayatollah so-and-so says something, it doesn't mean that the population goes along with it. This goes for all countries. The second thing I would like you to, anyone who reads the book, is not only to read it and put it aside, but talk about it to your children, to your friends, to your friends' children, and let this story be told, let this story be heard. And similar stories, by the way, there are others. As I mentioned earlier, as I was doing my research, I found out that there were other diplomats, Iranian diplomats, that did this. And then I was one time invited to the State Department on the 6th floor where the big guys are. And there were delegations from various countries whose relatives actually had helped. Wallenberg's niece was there, for instance. There was somebody from Mexico who had done this, from Argentina, and so numerous countries. So there were lots of people who went out of their ways to do the right thing. And that is a story that really ought to be known. So that is what I would like you to do.
And I have to tell you, I have a colleague of mine who's sitting back there, the director of our Confucius Center. And he was telling me when he heard about you, he was telling me a couple of days ago in a meeting we had, that there is also a story of a Chinese man or diplomat who saved the lives of 4,000 or 5,000 Jews. And so one of the things I want to do next year is to see if we can have an event about the help of that Chinese man to help the Jews.
Shiguhara is the name of him. He also did this. So there are quite a number of people who really have done great things.
Right. Well, with this, I want to thank you for that excellent presentation. And now I'm going to open it to question and answer from the audience. As you know, I have a rule. And the rule is that you ask questions. And the question ends with a question mark. So please, no commentary. Ask your questions. And then if we have time, we'll go to our question. I'll go first to this lady back there. Please introduce yourself. Would you give her the microphone? Be kind enough to introduce yourself. Thank you. What is it? Turn it off.
Good evening. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm Fariborz Sanchez. Salam man Irani hastam. Thank you, Mohsen, for hosting this. I have a very simple question because I want to take it to modern day context. It's obvious that since the revolution, we haven't had a wonderful track record of religious tolerance in Iran. People have not been able to practice their faiths, do their rituals. People have not been able to travel freely, as evidenced by my fellow Baha'is. And I would like to know, are the Jews under the same restrictions, or do they have more freedom? Are they allowed to practice since the revolution, or are they also underground?
Okay, that's a very good question. And in fact, it's a painful question to answer. Baha'is are really are badly treated because the clergy, the Iranian clergy, the Shiite clergy, see the Baha'is as a direct threat to their legitimacy. And that is quite different from the situation that the Jews are in, or the Christians are in, or the Zoroastrians are in. They are different religions, and therefore they are tolerated. They have representatives in the parliament, and so on and so forth. Baha'is, however, are seen as a group who have broken away from Islam, and therefore they are threatening to the foundations of the clergy's legitimacy. And therefore they are treated very badly. So the way they are treated is not, or let's say the Jews are treated a lot better than the Baha'is. And that's a shameful thing, by the way.
In the Iranian parliament, Christians have 3 seats. Jews have 1 seat for about 9 to 20,000 Jews that live in Iran. And Zoroastrians have 1 seat. Unfortunately, the Baha'is, that are, in my estimate, are probably more than 20,000 in Iran, much more than that. They don't have any seats. Their religion is not recognized by the Islamic Republic, and the treatment they get is simply shameful. There is no justification for the treatment these people get in Iran or outside of Iran. So I completely understand the frustration you and a lot of other people have. It's legitimate. Thank you. Please, go ahead and introduce yourself. I know you, but others do not.
Hi, my name is Eric Walters. I'm a local community person here. I am also a romantic at heart, and I was perusing your book. Could you tell us more about Chin Chin and her relationship with Sardari?
No, this is a love story. Chin Chin was a opera singer. She was a musician, artist from China. Her parents were industrialists, and the father was an industrialist, wealthy guy, had sent his daughter and his son to France because she wanted to study music, and the parents didn't want her to be alone. Well, the brother, shortly after the war started, by the way, when the war started, they couldn't communicate with China because that is the time that also the revolution in China had started and so on. So Chin Chin and her brother were cut off from communicating with home. Shortly after the war started, the brother, Chin Chin's brother, got sick, appendicitis, and died. So Chin Chin was all alone. Sardari, by that time, had fallen in love with Chin Chin. By the way, her name was not Chin Chin. Her name was, her first name I don't remember, but last name was Yao. He called her Chin Chin. That's sort of, as an affectionate sort of thing. Well, he was in love with Chin Chin and wanted to marry her. But Chin Chin insisted that she has to get permission from her parents before, they do that. And of course, during the war, they were together, they lived together, and so on. When the war ended, she went home to get her parents' blessing, but the revolution had engulfed the country, and she got lost. She never came back, and the parents disappeared, and so on. So, to his dying day, he thought of Chin Chin. In fact, he had commissioned a bust of Chin Chin, and that was among his possessions when he died.
Fariborz, I think you should start writing your second book about that love story. And believe me, you're going to sell a lot of it. That is a great story. Yeah. Questions? Yes, Professor Hiba Hashish, professor in our department, and one of our great supporters.
Make a comment, reinforce your message. I was in Tunisia during the occupation in World War II. I was a child. I saw, maybe at that time, 4 or 5 Nazi Germans looking for Jews. My heroic mother defending our neighbors, but passing them for Arabs. Years later, as a student, I had the privilege to be invited to join the first American interfaith delegation for peace in the Middle East. At Yad Vashem, I said the story about my mother. In my studies, I learned that the king of Morocco, Mohammed V, and the king of Tunisia, the Bey of Tunisia, the smaller king, both of them declared that their Jewish citizens protected when Hitler was trying to infiltrate North Africa to turn them against the French colonial power. So when Dr. Milani talked about organizing something, the time is really today. Bring all those stories, especially from the Muslim world, where we find the same thing. You mentioned the State Department, sir. I had the honor to go to the State Department to report our mission for peace when Dennis Ross was working at that time under his own boss, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. I shared my story, and he said, "Oh, I met your new ambassador. Please tell him hello if you're going to see him." And he said the same thing. So this is wonderful, but we forget, sir. We forget. I'm very, very honored to have listened to you. I will read your book, and I will talk about it in class. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I add a comment?
Please.
Allow me to add one comment to that. The Prime Minister of Morocco at the time had a farm away from the country has a very nice shore, and most of the population is along the Atlantic shore. But he had a farm inside the country. And he actually invited many of the Jews in Morocco who were threatened for reasons that, I don't know, maybe their names or whatever. And he took them to his farm, and they lived there for the duration of the time that the Germans were in North Africa. So,
Yes. Would you give the phone to this gentleman here?
Milani, I'm strictly abiding by your rules. Only question.
Thank you.
Is your book translated to Farsi or Hebrew?
it has been translated to Hebrew. Believe it or not, there is a magazine in Israel called Hayem. And Hayem translated this I think it's a monthly magazine. So I don't know whether they translated the whole thing or part of it, but they did, and they published that. In Farsi, it hasn't been translated.
Stein, is it available in any language, English or whatever? The book?
It is available in English. God willing, it will be translated in other languages.
Any other questions? Well, our time is up, and once again, I want to thank you for coming here. And I have to tell you, you have inspired me, and I'm pretty sure you have inspired a lot of other people. There are a lot of good people all over the world, from just about every country. And I'm very happy that tonight, with your story, you have touched just a little bit of that goodness that I see in a lot of people. So with that, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this program. Thank you.
You're watching American History TV.